Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We're talking with John Peterson. He's Assistant Director of Curriculum for Hillsdale College's K-12 Education Office, also lecturer in education and politics at Hillsdale College. John, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Talking today about the history of American education, and you do a graduate class on the subject, to someone with the background to talk about the subject. How do changes in American education reflect changes in America, the country generally?
Well, the changes in education reflect changes in the sources of American population. So where do Americans come from? What class of society do they come from? The earlier colonists were mostly English and middle class, whereas later waves immigrants were Irish, Eastern European, often lower class. And there was always a sense in America that widespread education was needed. So the change in the makeup of the country changed what that education would look like. And they also reflect changes in size and modes of production. So, I mean, America at the time of the founding was only 2.5 million people, but by the Civil War, it was 10 times that. And now it's well over 10 times that again. America also became much more urban and industrial in the 19th century. So American education focused more on the transmission of skills for work in an industrial economy and less on well-rounded liberal education necessary for an agrarian republic.
What periods or phases would you identify in the history of American education?
You could do that in different ways, but what I would say is first you'd have a colonial period where the focus of education is primarily literacy in scripture and emphasis on piety and religion, especially in New England. And then second, a period leading up to and after the founding where there was a lot of thinking about what particularly is necessary in education for Republican citizenship. And classical education, especially classical history, is taken for granted as the content of education, although you get thinkers and statesmen like Franklin who want to de-emphasize things like Latin and focus more on utilitarian instruction and turn away from the older English models. Then you get a third, an antebellum period where common schools are established in many states. That is to say, public schools where the desire for a universal publication that existed at the founding is now being realized, and its character is being decided, which is generally in a more secular rather than religious direction, although in ordinary cases, the content of the education is still somewhat classical. And then fourth, you'd get a progressive period, later 19th, early 20th century, where leaders in American education are borrowing theories from Germany and German and Swiss thinkers and practitioners in education and developing them for the American context. And it's really here that there's a decisive turn away from classical education. And then finally, I would identify a more radical period starting in the 60s and 70s where progressive liberalism's effort on sort of creating an authoritative Americanism promoting pro-American institution of public education was rejected. And the leading thinkers and practitioners in education redefined it as a kind of collaborative, deconstructive, activist effort on the part of students and teachers together to undermine and replace existing power structures and focus more on education for global leadership rather than anything particularly Western or American.
So where does this idea of universal public education come from, and how does that play out in practice in America?
Yeah, good. The founders had this idea as well as in the 19th century and with the progressives, but they were much less egalitarian than we are. So they didn't expect that you could have the same level of education for everyone. But it's still a uniform view among them. Any of the founders who write about education say Republican citizenship requires diffusion of knowledge. So they're saying things like every child. So Noah Webster, for example, says in our American republics, where government is in the hands of the people, knowledge should be universally diffused by means of public schools. What kind of knowledge? Americans should be acquainted with their own country. They should, he says, read books that furnish them with ideas that will be useful in life and practice. But especially he should rehearse the history of his own country. He should lisp the praise of liberty, etc. But George Washington also calls for a plan of universal education. And he particularly was interested in a distinctive American education that would form a common people out of the distinct parts of the nation. At that point, education, those institutions don't exist. And education is still in the hands of the separate states. So no federal plan of education could make this a reality. So it was the work of Horace Mann and Henry Barnard in the middle of the 19th century that really made it happen. And so states start to pass laws entitling all children to free public education. But the interesting thing there is that they were both strongly impressed and influenced by German practices and curriculum and pedagogy, and they worked to import them into the United States. So, suffice it to say that these practices were mostly unclassical and even anti-classical and more consistent with the administrative despotism they came from than the free republic they were being brought into. And this is ironic because, Washington and the other founders who were concerned about creating a public education in the United States were also very concerned about avoiding foreign influences in education, so that the architects of the public school system in the United States would express a desire to import wholesale the German administrative system and so-called scientific methods in education would have horrified them.
What strands in American education do you see at the beginning that are still prevalent today?
Yeah, there are certainly seeds or roots of the later developments at the founding. They don't all come from a German or continental European influence. For example, among the founding generation, there's a real optimism about what can be accomplished. Samuel Smith, in an essay on liberal education in 1798, writes that the happiness of man advances in the nation which cultivates science and the arts, and this improvement is susceptible of endless extension. So Horace Mann saying 50 years later that we find ourselves capable of ever onward improvement, and we've only done 1/100th of what we can do in education. That's not unprecedented. And then, another 50, 60 years later, Lester Frank Ward saying that the great problem is to equalize intelligence. He says to put all knowledge in the possession of every human being. That's not what the founders would have said, but still that idealism or optimism is there. And then also, I would say from the very early colonial period, even there's an ideal of widespread common education. It's an ideal, even though at that point, you're really talking about only probably 15% getting any kind of formal education and only 5% past the age of 12. But those who wrote and legislated about education clearly had the ideal in mind of a wide diffusion of knowledge. But at some point, that becomes conflated with a destratification of education, with the notion that there really can't be any distinction between education of elites and education of common American. And the founders very much believed that especially those who would become statesmen and leaders in society should have classical education. And that's really what dies. It's not well defended as a thesis into the 19th century. There's a Yale report of 1828 is famous. It's a kind of last gasp defense of this notion, although in practice, it takes decades more for the content of elite education really to be hollowed out.
Talking with John Peterson, he's Assistant Director of Curriculum for Hillsdale College's K-12 Education Office, about the history of American education. So what is progressive education and how did it begin?
Good. Yeah. I mean, that's a controversial issue, a question that can be answered in different ways. I mean, in some sense, progressive education begins even before the Civil War through the influence of Mann and Barnard and the establishment. I mean, just through the establishment of what is called a normal school. It's a term taken from Europe, but a normal school is essentially a professional finishing school for a teacher, a professional training school. So with that comes this definition of education where properly teaching children is not within the capacity of the ordinary educated person. You need a special training in scientific methods to take into account the distinct nature of children and how they learn at each stage. And so that's progressive education in one sense. So it would begin that early. But a more robust or strict definition, you would say that education completely abdicates the authority of the teacher and of the tradition. It makes the child's world rather than the adult world, the teacher's world, the center. That really comes in the late 19th and early 20th century. So an example of that would be the psychologist G. Stanley Hall. In 1901, he wrote in The Ideal School is Based on Child Study that before we let the pedagogue loose upon childhood, not only must each topic in his curriculum give an account of itself, but the inroads must be justified in the case of each child. So we have to overcome, he says, the fetishism of the alphabet, of the multiplication table, of grammars, of scales, and of bibliolatry, that is, worship of books. And he was called the Darwin of the mind, and this was called the Copernican revolution in education. That is to say, instead of revolving around the teacher and the curriculum, it now revolves around the child. That's the real revolution in progressive education.
Are there disagreements? Are there different camps that exist even within progressive education itself?
Yes. So there's a strand that really takes the authority and the independence of the child to heart and doesn't want to hinder his inner development or upset the natural expansion of his capacities by imposing anything external, any kind of vision of society. And then there's a strand which says, look, the job of the teacher isn't to lead students individually, it's to remake society. And Dewey's the most famous writer and thinker on American education, says, I believe the teacher is engaged in not training individuals, but the formation of the proper social life. The teacher is the prophet of the true God and the usherer in of the true kingdom of God. So there's a kind of war might be too strong, but there's a kind of conflict or tension between the psychologists and the sociologists. The psychologists are trying to perfect a system of individual education that is empirical, it's independent of any inherited assumptions or the authority of the tradition, and they're not trying to impose, at least overtly, any new social order, whereas the sociologists emphasize the other side of the equation. I mean, the equation is essentially they're all Darwinians at heart. So you're talking about the child as a kind of organism that's developing in its environment. And that environment is shaped by it includes its the social aspects. So the family, the farm, the town, the community, the nation, and you develop your powers by interacting with that environment. And the goal is you become a fully realized social organism, not an individual. And the capacities are shaped at every level. But the sociologists emphasize that the social direction, we're trying to make a better world. The social problems of this world exist because of these malformed organisms that learn selfishness. They learn all sorts of error through bad inputs. So we need to control the inputs to give students a new social consciousness. And that's a real tension. And for a while, the sociologists lose. Essentially, it becomes less ambitious. It's more focused on the development of the individual child's capacities rather than the social output.
How have the fields of sociology, psychology, pedagogy, how have they affected education in America?
Well, yeah, they've become the authority in terms of professional education. So the discipline of education has come to borrow their scientific authority from the findings of those fields, whereas previously education was a kind of offshoot of the liberal arts and sciences. I mean, that would be the easiest and quickest to answer. So if you want to get to the roots of changes in American education, you have to look at how those disciplines emerged and what they were meant to overthrow or contradict, which is to say the more traditional accounts of what a human being is, how a human being knows things, what the human good is. So things like political philosophy, literature, the humanities generally, and the liberal arts.
And then what kind of pushback has there been against progressive education in America?
Yeah, there has been significant pushback at various points, but it's often the most sort of spectacular failures. So the silliest things, like what they're doing in the silly kindergarten where the children are given free rein to their expression. And there have been many sort of progressive follies and things that have emerged. So most famously, people know about whole language learning. And so then in like the 50s, there was a book called Why Johnny Can't Read. And it's making fun of that kind of thing where, it's a serious issue because you simply are not getting results when you take these progressive projects and then they're imported sort of wholesale into, not sort of elite lab schools, but mainstream American education. And so, for example, after the First War, but especially after the Second World War, you get real conservative reaction and a return to standard, an emphasis on returning to standards. And of course, the space race reinforces that. Like, hey, we just need to teach math and science skills. We don't need to be letting children, experience the inner needfulness of their learning. They really just need to develop those skills. So that has tended to be the conservative reaction, is focusing on results, basics. So the 3 R's was a big, William Bennett in the 80s and 90s. And then in 2000s, like No Child Left Behind, things, we emphasize standards, testing. Conservative reactions haven't really confronted as much as they should the theoretical assumptions, especially this disciplinary aspect. So what authority do these disciplines like psychology and pedagogy as a distinct discipline have? And I think classical education is also in the danger, it has some danger in not confronting those things, but it has shown the most promise in terms of conservative reactions to progressive education and to these changes overall, sort of being most thoughtful about what in the older tradition needs to be recovered and what we can take from scientific discoveries in education and adapt going forward.
John Peterson is Assistant Director of Curriculum for Hillsdale College's K-12 Education Office, also a lecturer in education and politics here at Hillsdale College, talking about the history of American education. John, thanks so much for joining us here on the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast.
Thank you, Scott.
I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K12. That's Hillsdale_K12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.